least to the Board of Deputies, who can take it up with the editors or the publishers or whatever. So there is all of that, but it's not all about me. We've got this tremendous panel in alphabetical order. I'm going to start with Deborah because her first name begins with D. And Deborah's an old mate. We've worked together over the years, and she really is one of the absolute mainstays of the RE world. I first met her as a teacher, and then she became involved in the larger field of advising on how the whole RE thing unfolds. She's currently research officer for the National Association for Teachers of RE. She's secretary of the RE Council, chair of the RE Policy Unit for NATRI, the RE Council and RE Today, and quite rightly, she got an OBE from the Queen in 2016. Birthday honours, I got mine 6 months earlier, but that's all right. That's no harm in that. Anyway, Deborah's just tremendous, and I'm really, really pleased that we have her on this panel. Continuing in alphabetical order, we've got Eve Sacker from Derby, and Eve is the development officer for the Derby Open Centre. More and more cities are developing these collective centres for RE and advice, and it's really grand that Eve is in that role. She's a multicultural and interfaith educator, and she's worked on all kinds of aspects of educational development in this. And she's got an MA in religious studies, so I mean you can't argue with that, can you? So really, really good to have Eve on board from Derby. I've got bored of this alphabetical order thing. I'm going to go for Sam now. I mean, that's tedious otherwise, isn't it? I'm going to go for Sam. Sam, we've already met. He's at Leicester. He's just outed himself as non-Jewish, but that's all right, Sam. We don't mind. We're into diversity here. We can accommodate that. Deborah too, by the way, not Jewish, despite her first name. And Sam's first name comes to that. But Sam, we've heard a remarkable work that he's been doing in Leicester. Frances Jeans. It says Jewish Museum London. She's soon to be transported if she hasn't gone already. She is currently, or has been, the director of the Jewish Museum, given it a tremendous push in its educational work, not least. And she was, prior to that, she was the director of learning and engagement. I think really raised its profile in that means. But she's moving on to something else, and I can't remember what. So the first thing she's going to say when we unmute people is to tell us what that is. I'm useless, aren't I, really? And finally, we've got Carenza Passmore, last but not least. Carenza is the director of the Northeast Religious Resources Centre. So another one of those gatherings of resources and personnel. So she oversees the centres in the Northeast, and it's remarkable to have someone such as Carenza covering this whole area of the country and drawing together the resources that are available. And she says, greater than the sum of its parts, which is often the case, of course, when you get folk bouncing off each other. And that's part of what I guess we experienced in the breakout groups as well, that individuals do what they do, but coming together, we can do so much more. And Carenza's got a particular interest in film and Holocaust education and a post-colonial view of RE. And in many ways, that brings me perhaps to the first topic I'd quite like to explore with you all, because religious education is seeking to shift a bit from religious education. We start to hear about worldviews and a recognition, of course, as I mentioned right at the very beginning, some of us might have assumed that a lot of the people in front of us were Christian or had been brought up in a Christian outlook or something. Well, we know that simply isn't the case, because a huge number of people who wouldn't call themselves religious in any way whatsoever. So what does RE have to say to them? What is this worldviews thing about? I'm going to start perhaps with Deborah, if I may, just to kind of give us a bit of a background. Does this worldview shift mean anything for how we talk about Judaism? Or do we carry on doing what we do and it'll slot into the newly revised religions and worldviews approach? Deborah.
Thank you very much, Clive. Stop me when you need to, because obviously I could probably talk about this for a full day, which I won't. So yes, the worldviews approach was originally proposed by the Commission on RE, 2018. The Commission on RE was commissioned by the RE Council. And the reason it was decided, and the argument made in the Commission's report, was that unfortunately, some people, when they're teaching religious education, can teach religions into very tight little boxes. And sometimes what that leads to is quite a stereotypical kind of vision. So particularly if you haven't got much time on the timetable or so on. And I saw a curriculum in a secondary school recently, which is not unusual. Lesson 1, 50 minutes, Introduction to Judaism. Lesson 2, the Holocaust, 50 minutes, the end. And if you imagine that is what a child's experience of Judaism is, well, you can see how that can end. So the worldviews approach basically says, right, well, everybody may not be religious, but they all have a worldview. They all have a way of looking at the world, a way of responding and experiencing the world. And if we take that approach when we start our teaching religious education, then we include everyone, and we're not presenting something which they feel is alien to them, and many children do come from a non-religious perspective. The mistake sometimes people see in the worldviews approach is they assume that when we talk about religion and worldviews, we're just adding non-religious worldviews. That could be further from the truth. We're talking about the concept of religion, and we're talking about religious and non-religious worldviews. When we say worldviews, religious and non-religious. Sam spoke earlier about lived experience. Lived experience is absolutely central to the worldviews approach, because as soon as you start talking about individuals' lived experience, the diversity starts coming in. And so we think it's really important for people like you that are working with schools, and then people are meeting you, to know about the worldviews approach, because I think what you're going to find is you're doing it anyway. So if you go on the RE Council's website, you'll see a section called Worldviews, and you can read at whatever level you want. There's a FAQ section, which is just very short. If you want to really go into the academic rigor, there's also discussion papers and all sorts of things. And so what we're trying to do is to help people to just sort of discover it, and to learn more about it. And there's a big project going on in schools at the moment with, because there's a resource developed for syllabus writers, and 3 teams of people are developing syllabuses based on that draft resource, basically just to see if it works. So there'll be more materials coming out, and more for you to learn as we go along. Is that enough, Clive?
Yeah, that's grand. Thank you. That's an excellent overview of it all. I'm going to ask Karenza and Eve, because they're obviously working in this RE field out there, not least with schools directly, whether this worldviews thing affects the way in which you work. I mean, because Deborah's already talked about the lived experience thing, and I talked at the outset about talking about your own life. But you've got to find a good way of talking about those people with whom you don't agree. It's not good enough to try and suggest that the way you do it is the right way or the best way, or the, whatever you may think about it, or some way denigrate those who don't agree with you, or suggest that nobody bothers with that anymore. People do it like me. But of course, once you start talking about your own life, you are doing a worldviews thing rather than an official religion spokesperson. And it's useful, I think, perhaps to always say, I'm not an official spokesperson. I'm a Jew. I'm just a Jew telling you about this Jew's life. Karenza, perhaps first, and then Eve, does this worldviews thing, has it impacted on what you do, what people ask for from you?
If it's okay, I'd like Eve to go first as a Jewish person in the room, and then I can chase up if that's okay, Clive.
Oh, okay. Eve, go on then.
Okay, I'm actually going to start by talking about our non-Jewish stuff. So just for those that don't know the Derby Open Centre, one of the things we do is organise tours of places of worship, because everything apart from the shul is in walking distance, so they can go to a church, a mosque, a gurdwara. And I've actually found that the worldview approach is really useful with our staff. Now, most of our staff are not educationally qualified. They are just a Muslim talking about their faith. They're a Sikh talking about their faith. And it's very useful to talk in these terms because they do make the assumption that everyone in front of them has a Christian knowledge or comes from a Christian background. So I've found in terms of our staff training, it's very useful for them also to appreciate that there is a diversity within their own tradition. So the mosque that we work with, for example, is a Sunni Pakistani heritage mosque, and they tend to forget the very small Bangladeshi community and so on. So the worldviews approach has been quite useful for us in terms of opening out perspectives. We're not necessarily getting it coming through from teachers yet. At primary, I'm hearing more of it from secondary, which is my background. But I think the issue with primary is obviously you're not necessarily specialists. So it's taking a slightly longer time to percolate through there. I don't know if you found that, Karenza.
Yeah, I would just say, by the way, I mean, Eve has perfectly naturally also used the word faith. She's talked about, the Muslims or the Sikhs talking from their own faith background. I said at the outset that I'm uncomfortable with the word Judaism. I'm uncomfortable with the word religion, and I'm equally uncomfortable with the word faith as a synonym for what it is we think we're doing. So in English and in Protestant England, faith and religion might work as a synonym. But I would think for a very significant number of folk, not least amongst Christians, Catholics and Orthodox, they might well say, well, I'm Greek Orthodox, but I don't believe in any of that nonsense, right? So faith doesn't necessarily work as a synonym, but we frequently have these words loaded on us, and at least we should be a little bit skeptical or uneasy, even if we find ourselves using the words, because that's what other people do. Karenza.
My experience is a little bit reversed from where Eve is because of the kinds of things that we do. So I manage a resources centre. I want to talk about something else later on in terms of the hub work, but the resource centre work. And so I see it as my job to make sure that we resource teachers and children from both ends, what they see in the classroom given to them by the teacher and what teachers understand about their own role and work. So we organise online talks and things, and Eve has done some of these on the diversity of Judaism. We've discussed why observant might be a more useful word when you're looking at Judaism in some of its different manifestations, as opposed to some other words which might be less appropriate. We've also taken apart all of our artifacts boxes and turned them into sort of story boxes, which is something I learned from the Jewish Museum and something I learned from the Board of Deputies. So what the Resources Centre tends to do is beg, borrow and steal from anybody in the room. And I've already been emailing you, some of you during this session, or messaging you saying, can I learn more about that? Can I have this? Can I have that? So what we hope to do is equip non-specialists. So a primary school teacher can come in for early years and they can pick up a box and they can lay that table for Shabbat. And the teacher's notes, which Eve has helped us to write, will tell them about what this might be working for in some communities, but how it might be different for others, or what the diversity might look like. So we're trying to enable teachers to ask the relevant questions about where do you stand in this, i.e. what do you know and what do you need to learn? What are you going to introduce your children to in terms of the curriculum? And is that curriculum that you have sufficiently broad enough and engaging? But one of the underestimations I think we can make with teachers is that actually they do know their children. And there aren't many primary school teachers that don't think their children are incredibly diverse. And they are able to start from the diversity in their classroom to the diversity of other people's traditions and outside of that. So there is a little bit about how educators can help build on what teachers already do, but take them into those specifics, as you've said, from personal experience or specific tradition or family life, to expand that for them a little bit.
Thank you, Corinne. Karenza, and you said you want to talk about RE hubs, and we will before this session is over. You mentioned Frances and her influence on your work, the storyness of this. And I've noticed in the chat that somebody asked, what words would I use instead of Judaism and faith and belief and stuff? And I think where I would want to start is, and to say to a group or whoever's in front of me, I want to talk to you about either the Jewish people or Jewish people. That's where I would start. And that then brings you to the business of worldviews. It brings you to stories. So we're not talking about artifacts and bits and bobs and stuff. We're talking about people. I think the Jewish people is a central concept that that most identifying Jews would readily recognize. Yes, I'm connected. I belong. That's where I am, even if they might want to accept this group or that group from their definition of the Jewish people. I think that, and that's where I would very much like to kind of start and stay. And then I talk about the Jewish tradition, culture, these things I think are very useful synonyms. But Francis, reference has been made to your work. I asked you to tell us where you're going next, because we have no intention of letting you go, Francis. You're too important to us. We're going to keep you hanging around this field, whatever your next job is. So tell us that, and then tell us a little bit about this story box idea.
Thanks, Clive. So yeah, I've just stepping down as the director of the Jewish Museum London, and I'm actually just taken up the post of director of education and engagement at Parliament. So a whole different set of things to be involved with, particularly at the moment. So in the same field, I've already met Deborah. We've already had a meeting about where we overlap in the future. So lots of overlap still with teachers, particularly Teachers Salary, PhD, and that. But I'm staying involved with the museum as a trustee, so always contact me with anything to do that we can help. When it comes to the topic of worldviews, this is something we've really carefully thought about. I've always taken it very seriously that the Jewish Museum, we're unaffiliated, so we're not part of a synagogue that was part of a movement, and therefore we have a real obligation to make sure that we are representing all Jewish people, which is quite a task to undertake. Especially in education, with all the problems we have with time. So worldviews has been a really interesting thing for us. I actually think it overlaps hugely with the topic of diversity, and we talk about diversity of thought, diversity of people. So we actually have first piloted how to use the topic of worldviews in our education classes through something called Inclusive Judaism, and I'll put a link in the chat. Effectively, the simplest version I can say is we basically talk about it as Jewish and. So there's a whole host of resources which are about being Jewish and something. And these are the intersectional parts of our identity which give us a worldview. So part of how I see the world is because of my Jewish background. Part of it is because I'm a woman. Part of it is because I grew up partly in Australia and partly here. All these things make up my view of the world. So the Inclusive Judaism Project is a way that teachers can use resources which give a worldview from someone who is Jewish and liberal, or Jewish and Haredi, or Jewish and black, or Jewish and gay, and all the variation within that. So for us, it's been a very practical way for us to think, okay, if we're going to try and talk about worldviews, what does that mean when we try and use resources in the classroom with teachers? That's our first pilot approach to how we can do that. And we've been using that in classrooms with kids and also doing teacher training with it. I'll put the link in there. If anyone's, you're completely free to use any of those resources yourself. You don't have to ask, you can just use them. But if anyone wants to know more about that approach, we can always get in touch as well.
Thank you, Francis. That Jewish and is a lovely idea, and I think really would help us all if we tried to stress. I remember going to, those of you who know me know that I frequently wear sandals rather than shoes and socks. And I went to a thing and I gave the most fascinating overview of Judaism, completely riveting as you would expect. And at the end of it, I said, right, are there any questions? And one of the children said, yes, why don't Jews wear socks? Right, how do they know this? I'm the only Jew they've seen, and it's a bit odd to be in February without socks, so they think that must be a Jewish thing. So the Jewish and thing, I think that's wonderful, Francis. I've just noticed in the chat that somebody's made reference, lots of people are indicating their educational experience, their educational training, and Penny Kay from Sheffield has quite rightly said, it's not essential to have it for your audience, and their needs is what matters. And that's absolutely true. And just remember, you're not delivering a speech. You're trying to talk to people, and that's the thing, to engage with them. I want to come to something which arose in one of the breakout sessions, and this is about charging. I know that Jews feel terribly uneasy about charging because won't everybody go, oh, well, there you go, the Jews again and money and stuff, right? And feel very self-conscious about that. I want to ask people on the panel, if somebody's trekked halfway across the country, or the synagogue's opened itself and put the heating and the lights on and stuff, is it reasonable to charge? Do you charge? Would you charge? What do you think would be fair? And especially if you're going to provide them with food and stuff. I remember the Sikhs back in the 1970s, when they first wanted to open their gurdwaras, they found themselves feeding vast quantities of people, because it's required if somebody visits a gurdwara to feed them, and they couldn't afford to do this. How are they supposed to behave? So what about charging? Sam, do you charge people to come to your centre? And if so, how much? Let's talk details here.
So we have an optional donation system. Basically, the community is in a position where, thankfully, they're in a solid financial state. They don't have to charge, and particularly now with all the heritage funding, at least in the short term, things are fairly stable. But they've always traditionally asked for a small donation, and it's made very clear to the schools at all time that it's not a barrier to entry. If they can't afford it, if the children can't, pull together a donation, that's completely fine. All comers are welcome. We ask, I believe, a guideline price of £3 per student. And sometimes we get that, and sometimes we get a much smaller packet, and sometimes we don't get anything at all. It'll be interesting to see over the coming years. So once we're out of the heritage funding period, and when the economy continues to be terrible, what happens longer term, whether we have to start making ends meet. But for the time being, the community is very stable and very happy to kind of say that here's something you can do to help us acquire more resources. But if you can't afford it, then we'd rather have you here than not, is kind of our approach.
Right. We should always remember, shouldn't we, that Joseph advised Pharaoh in the years of plenty to set stuff aside for the years of famine. And so if you happen to have a lot of resource at the moment, might be a wise time to start trying to build resource for when you don't have in future. Others, Eve, what do you think about this charging business?
This is one of those great questions, both at the Open Centre and actually at my shul as well, at Nottingham Liberal Synagogue, because we were having so many people coming in. Every time someone comes in, you've got to turn the heating on. And importantly, in a Jewish setting, you've got to have the caretaker or some sort of security on the premises. This was quite a concern in my particular shul. That costs money. We are not as financially confident as other communities. So after much discussion, we have introduced, like Leicester, a voluntary donation. I think ours is actually £2.75 per student. At the Open Centre, we have been a victim of government funding cuts, unfortunately. So we used to be funded by local race equality councils who would they would pay for schools to come. Effectively, the students and the families were paying nothing to do our visits and our workshops and things like that. Unfortunately, all of that went with government funding cuts, and ever since we have been self-funding. And it's a very, very difficult balance to strike. We usually charge for a faith tour £2.70 per child per venue. We then have costs for our workshops. We do a lot going out to school, and a lot of my Jewish work is actually that, because the shul is not in Derby. I go out to schools, and that will be around about the sort of £80 level per workshop. But of course, school budgets are very, very tight and possibly about to get tighter. So it's a constant battle, a negotiation. It's very difficult to say this is exactly what we will fund, because we're trying to give discounts where we can, but we have running costs. We've got to train people, we've got DBS checks to do, we've got insurance to pay, all that sort of thing. So it's horrible. It's probably the worst part of actually doing this work, is trying to make it affordable.
Thank you, Eve. Deborah, I mean, you're not directly involved in this, but what's your feeling about it? Should people charge? And because there is a view that says that if you don't charge, people don't value it. You know, they don't pay anything, so if it becomes inconvenient, they just don't turn up, or whatever it might be. So what do you think about this?
Well, I think that there's two things here, isn't there? I mean, the first one is travelling expenses for visitors coming into schools. If you go and travel to an interview for a job, commonly you'll have those travelling expenses refunded. So I don't think there's any problem with people asking for travelling expenses if they go to visit a school. I think that's just courteous if you have a visitor that's coming to do something for you, that you pay for it. I've noticed in the authority I worked in, which is London Borough of Tower Hamlets, which has a rich group of different places to visit for schools, just how different institutions are able to deal with this. So, for example, London Buddhist Centre has an education team. They charge for visits. If you go to a local church, then they don't charge for the visits, but it's to do, I think, with the financial security, if you like, of those groups. I don't see there have been any decline in the number of schools visiting the London Buddhist Centre because they now charge. So I think that's interesting. The other thing that I mentioned is budget. Somebody mentioned budgets, and the budgets, according to the NATRE, the National Association of Teachers of RE, the most latest survey, says that on average, a primary school budget has 50p per child to spend on their religious education, i.e. books and everything, including visits. When I used to be, when I was head of RE, I often passed some of those costs of visits on to parents as voluntary donations. And I was always really pleased that even families with challenging financial circumstances would often be quite happy to give a donation towards a visit. So I think the donations route is a good one, because you can then pass that donation then on to the parents and make it voluntary for them. I think we've lost Clive, have we not?
We have. Shall I give an example of the charging situation at the museum, maybe while we wait for Clive to return? So we do a completely chargeable service at the museum and have done for a number of years. And in fact, when we implemented the chargeable service, our bookings increased substantially. So I'm sure a lot of research can be done into that, but I think there is something in the knowledge of what people value and what they don't. That changes as the situation changes economically, though. So that's not a given that because it worked 5 years ago, it worked tomorrow. We have a chargeable service simply because we need to pay the professional educators to go out and do all the work. We have the costs of the building, which are not small. So, you know, it's in many ways a practical choice. But we have a bursary scheme. So the charge for one workshop per child is £3.75. But most schools choose to do a full day. So they pay that workshop cost twice. They do 2 workshops in a day. So most schools are paying about £7.50, thereabouts. But we have a bursary scheme then that basically takes about 90% of those costs out. So if you happen to be a state school in London, or a SEND school or a PRU school, any of those, effectively the charge is taken off, and that's covered by a funder who helps us basically make those as close to free as we can possibly make it. So I would say about 65% of the kids who visit come through a bursary scheme. So that means they're paying probably about £1.25 a student. So that's very, very helpful to us to make sure that we're reaching the kids that we want to be reaching. But I will say briefly that our charging structure is exactly the same, whether you visit the museum, whether we come on outreach, or whether you do a digital, it's the same cost. And I was really firm about that when we moved into COVID and we launched the digital service, because I believe that the environment we're teaching in is different, but the access to the expert educators, to the resources, everything else is exactly the same. And that's what they're asking for. They're actually not from us, and it's different depending on where you are. They're not actually always asking to come into the museum. What they want is to have an educator there to help answer questions, to help that sort of facilitating that discussions, which teachers often find tricky. And so that expertise was the same, regardless of whether we were in the museum, on outreach, or online. And I felt very strongly about that. And I've done a number of talks about it, because not everybody felt the same for a number of reasons. But I'll stop there. I can see Ed's joined maybe to help us facilitate.
Francis, that was a really good insight. I mean, I've experienced that schools, whilst they might be happy to pay for actually coming to the synagogue, have a problem with the transportation. And quite a lot of schools, if you're in inner London, then you have to get a bus. You can't go on the tube. You can't put the kids on the tube. Where the costs for transportation have failed, then the school visit has had to be postponed or just doesn't happen at all. What we say on JSCM in the preamble before, hopefully a teacher reads the preamble before they put in the request form to be matched up with a school. Here comes Clive back. We suggest that they are going to be faced with charges. They must sort of live in the real world. Either it's going to be a professional educator who provides those services, or there's different regimes in different communities, different synagogues, and they might have a fixed fee, they might have an overall fee, they might have a per head fee, or they might ask for a donation. But we always say, even if the community or the educator doesn't ask for any money, then they should really seriously consider making a donation, because they're getting something which they wouldn't otherwise have. And they should really help out in that way.
I've just come back in, folks. I'm sorry, I lost the connection and I lost you, but from Ed's comments, it sounds like we're still on the topic that I left you on, which was talking about charging and not charging.
Yeah, I think we've wrapped that up now, so over to you.
Okay, great, excellent. I want to come back, Karenza, you mentioned RE hubs. And if you could just tell us a bit about that, and then I've got another topic I'd like us, your insights on, please.
Thank you. It's a delight to have several hats on in this meeting. So I'm a director of the Resources Centre in the North East, so resource people do get in touch with me if you're interested. I'm also the chair of the Federation of RE Centres, all tiny 5 or 6 of us, but if you run an RE centre, get in touch. But I'm also now the newly appointed North East lead for the coming RE Hubs, which is a national project co-funded by a wonderful coalition of organisations, many of whom are in the room. So if you've been in a session with Julia or other people, or Debbie, so the RE Council, lots and lots of organisations who've got together with some funding to appoint leads for the regions as the DFE has organised them, and also for Wales. And these are all people who are trying to interface with a brand new web resource that will be launched very shortly. Now, the reason I'm mentioning it now is because in the chat and in the discussions I've been in, lots of people have been saying, well, is there a way to find out about all these wonderful resources and groups and synagogues? Well, there will be a section on people and places to visit on this new website hub. But very significantly, it is going to ask people to jump through a kite mark hoop. Now, what this means is that if you're an educator in a synagogue, you can spend an hour and a half of your time online getting an absolutely fantastic, completely up-to-date briefing on what's going in RE, what's happening with worldviews, the kinds of things. It won't tell you how to be your deliverer in your place, because we know you're an expert in that already. It's more of an authentication. So you've got touch base with all the new things that are going on. You're completely up to date. It's an hour and a half. It's completely free, all on Zoom. And then you get a kite mark. And then you can then fill in your details as the educator for the shul or for the resource centre, wherever you are. And that will be all put into the regional areas of this new website. Now, there's lots of other things that are coming too on the website across the board, so I won't bore you with now. It's coming soon. There'll be lots of fluff about it coming, but I think it's a fantastic interface between teachers, educators, universities, RE organisations, and it will be a one-stop shop to find out who you need to talk to, when and how, with the kind of contacts there. And you'll all have different regional leads. Now, following this, when the email goes out, I can happily give you the links for the people and places of worship or faith community or non-faith community speaker training. I can put that into the chat later on. And I can also give you the heads up on the Hub's website when that comes out through the actual JSN organisation. But I think we should be celebrating the fact that RE organisations nationally, REAC, all of them, have got together to try and put this into place to support teachers. And it's open access for anybody who wants to support teachers. And you're just getting a brand new heads up because I happen to be in the room and I'm delighted to be sharing this space.
Well, Corinza, that's tremendous. And I'm going to ask Ed to make sure that in the follow-up information, which is distributed to all attendees, information as to how to contact the hub is good. I noticed in the chat that it's not Tony, I think it's Helen Frace, has said that there was a visit in last school where other religious communities were also speaking to different year groups, and she didn't charge, but if the others did, then it would be unbalanced. However, she says, and this is something I think we all kind of suffer from, alternatively, if I charge and others don't, it doesn't look good. Now, this fear about how it looks is a particularly Jewish fear around money, and we all understand it. We all know what's going on there. But of course, Jews are also the senior minority in this country. We have a certain responsibility here. And if we set an example that it's reasonable to charge, then we also relieve some of those poorer communities, a mosque that might be struggling, or as I mentioned, a Gurdwara, that it is reasonable to charge. And do no harm to contact your fellow Muslim speaker or your fellow Hindu visitor and say, what do you do? So that you can advance in unison, rather than feeling, well, I don't want people to badmouth Jews. And do remember, of course, that people who intend to badmouth Jews will do it however beautiful you are. So I wouldn't spend an awful lot of time worrying about those guys, but do what's sensible and sustainable. Because of course, if it gets to be too expensive, then you just eventually can't do it anymore. And that's not clever either. So do remember all of that. It kind of connects. Thank you, though, Corinza, for that about RE hubs. I can see huge amounts of excitement about that. You're going to be completely swamped in Durham, which is a nice place to visit anyway. I wrote to myself, is Judaism still popular? Now, back in the day when I started this game, it was the obvious other religion. Nobody understood what any of these other funny folk were doing. And every RE teacher who'd been to church reckoned they understood Christianity anyway, because they read the Old Testament or something. Understood Judaism, should I say, because they'd read the Old Testament. And as a result, you got this awful misrepresentation of what the Jews were about. But nevertheless, it was the obvious go-to other religion. If you had to do something else, do Judaism. That's no longer the case. And people have diverse reasons for being interested in other religions. Most agreed syllabuses require that you touch on Judaism. Very frequently they stick it in Key Stage 1 because there's a lot of color and you can eat stuff and there's festivals and so forth. So it often becomes quite, dare I say, infantilized, and then it's difficult to get a kind of grown-up encounter with it. Secondary level, it may not crop up. Now, many people in chat have referred to the fact that the Catholics, however, bless them, have come to our rescue on this matter, and they certainly have recognized the necessity, I think Catholics would say now, of Catholics understanding Judaism, and mostly in its own terms. I mean, there is a tendency for some Catholics still to see it as a kind of precursor to Christianity, but nevertheless, you know, most intelligent Catholics have tried to get this right and doing well. But otherwise, setting aside Catholics, I mean, certainly Church of England schools don't particularly have this view. And other non-denominational schools, mainstream state schools. Is Judaism still popular? Is it something, for example, that people are choosing to devote a lot of time to? Deborah mentioned this dreadful tendency to do a bit of Judaism, then some Holocaust and get it out of the way. A lot of people think I've done Judaism because we did the Diary of Anne Frank. And let's remember, the Diary of Anne Frank is largely not about the Holocaust. In some ways, it stops at the point at which the Holocaust starts. Anne Frank talks all about hiding from the Holocaust. It's not quite the same thing. So even the Holocaust is not done very well. But do people think that Judaism is still up there on people's agenda? If it isn't, what can we do to make it more popular, more interesting? Deborah, please, first.
I'm glad you asked this question, Clive, because like Karenza, I'm going to give you some hot off the press information. So the NATRE, the National Association of Teachers of RE, does a survey every 2 years of teachers of primary schools. I only do it every 2 years just to try and encourage more people to respond. We've got a good response this year, and it's about to be published at the beginning of next week. We ask this question every time, what religions do you include in your curriculum in primary schools? In 2018, 93% of the schools responding said that they included Judaism. In 2020, 88%. In 2022, 82%. It's falling. And I wonder why that is. And I think probably the reason is linked to another question we ask on our survey, which is, if you trained in the last 5 years, how many hours of RE-specific training did you have in your primary training course? 20% of the respondents said 0. No RE whatsoever in that PGCE course or in other training course. And another 20%, 19.7%, said that they had between 0 and 3 hours. So you imagine the whole of RE, 6 world religions, non-religious worldviews, and this thing called How to Teach It, somehow done in 3 hours or less than 3 hours. So somebody mentioned earlier about teachers' confidence and some of the misunderstandings and all that kind of thing. I'm afraid what we have to say here is that both those reasons, when people come to visit, or if you go to visit, you're going to have to assume that for many teachers, they will know very little about Judaism at all.
Well, Deborah, that's very useful, and for all of us on this conference. I know everybody is very overpressed and has very little time to do anything more than respond to the plethora of requests that come in. You know, I think you could spend all day in shul not davening, but instead just welcoming groups coming to see what's going on in your synagogue. But if you could find a corner of your time, I'm addressing this to everybody listening to this now, if you could find a corner of your time to approach your local PGCE RE course and say, I would love to give, and at this point I would offer it free, you know, you might even pay them. I would love to give an hour's session to your teachers, even out of hours, you know, one evening, a session to explain why teaching about Judaism is not just not difficult, as somebody in the chat said, scary. It's not just not difficult, not scary, but could be a great gateway for your pupils to approach RE while covering history or geography or, you know, a whole range of other topics that have to be covered. So even doing Hanukkah while the kids are doing the Greeks might be a way forward, or whatever it might be. So if you could find it in your hearts and times and diaries to make such an offer to where PGCE students are taught in your area, I think that might at least address something of what Deborah is saying. Francis and then Karenza, please.
I'm going to say, with my other hat on as a SACRA member, I think there's something really interesting about SACRAs here and inclusion of Judaism in school sort of SACRA curriculums, if you want to call them that, because they're based often on the local population. So I live out East London, it's real East London, Barking, right at the end of East London. And I think I'm one of a handful of Jewish people here. There's actually a huge community that I see every day to the station coming in from Essex, but I'm one of a very small number. There's no synagogue, there's no community here. And therefore, when we talk about in the SACRA, talking about who's in Barking and wanting to represent the local Jewish, like the local religions, Judaism's never going to make that list because we're way below the other religions that are in the borough. And there is something about that, you know, I know lots of people got different opinions on SACRAs and the positives and negatives, but that does mean that I think it's really interesting for a small community network where we're only a small number of people. It does make it tougher to make it relevant in the SACRA aspect of teaching the religions that are in your borough or your council, because we're always the minority and therefore sometimes much lower down in other communities. I haven't got much a solution to that. I just think it's something to raise thinking about how SACRAs work and small communities.
Thank you, Francis. Karenza.
It's two things really. Once in response to Francis' very clear point, the Resources Centre has just published, we've just published a whole set of advice and guidance on how you can do virtual exposure to different places of worship, which includes synagogues. So there are, as Sam's just done, there are lots and lots of films, and we've just done a tour of the Newcastle synagogue. There are lots of things online, including children's experience of those visits, that can help boost some of that or compensate a little bit for a lack of local community. So you can do that. The second thing is just to highlight that, back to the hub, one of the things that all of us as regional RE leads are currently doing is mapping all the PGCE and RE providers in our own regions so that we can then contact them and support. So whilst it might be useful for individual educators to try and contact some local skits, I teach in the North Tyneside skit, I teach the RE there, for example, actually there will be a much more coordinated approach coming through the RE hub with a national push to say, actually, did you know what's available here? Do you know who's available? So I think making sure that you've got your offer in your region up to the best you can possibly have it, and you're most aware of the curriculum needs around you, will be a really good investment for time for when we can get to those particular courses and make them much more aware.
Thank you, Corinne. So I noticed again in the chat that Vivian has said, wouldn't the drop in numbers wanting Judaism also be due to Muslim numbers being so much greater? Now, I don't know exactly what Vivian meant by that question, so I'm going to do what Jews invariably do when they're faced with a text, which is interpret it regardless of what the original author intended. So there are two possible ways of reading that. One possibility is simply there being more Muslims in the school. Isn't the school going to prefer to teach about Islam because that's the number of children that are there? And that, of course, does make sense, doesn't it, to some extent? Every child wants to be recognized. If you've got lots of Muslims but no Jews, it would be absurd to not teach about Islam. That's the thing that people are doing. The other possible interpretation of Vivian's statement, and I have no idea whether it was implicit, is that Muslims might be understood to be in some ways antipathetic to Jews, given the Middle Eastern tensions and so on, and therefore you might want to stay away from the topic because it could be a bit explosive. Now, I don't think that's universally true anyway, although there's quite a lot of evidence that there is some antipathy to Jews being generated within certain sections of the Muslim community. Certain Islamist articulations are gaining some foothold. But it brings me to the other possible response to what Francis said about being in an area where there are very few Jews. Why would they be on the agenda given that there are so many others? I don't think this is an argument one can make easily, but if you're in, for example, a Sacre where the discussion is going on about the place of, say, Judaism in a religious education program, if you had an all-white area, you would particularly want the school to make children sensitive to blacks. Because that's the very place where they don't meet them. And therefore, that's the very place in which nonsense and mythologies and whatnot can be generated, because they have no capacity to confirm what life is like beyond their own experience. And we do know that there is a rising tide of anti-Semitism. It's difficult to define perhaps and pin down, but it's certainly not denied by anybody. It's not just a Jewish concern. And in a place, therefore, where there are very few Jews, and therefore it's very difficult for people to confirm that Jews don't have horns because they've never met one, that might be specifically the place where teaching about Jews and Judaism might be suitable. So I do think there's an argument to be had there. And those of you who are on Sacres, if you find it difficult, if the numbers game is being played, I do believe actually that schools should not spend their time trying to have one of everybody in them. But they must be aware that they have to conduct a compensatory curriculum. That is, they must always say who's not here, and therefore we must teach about them. So if you're in a boys' school, you have a responsibility to ensure that your boys eventually leave the school sensitive to and properly educated about living in and around girls, because they're not there. If you've got an all-white school, you've got to prepare people for the fact that the world has non-white people in it, and so on. So that's certainly part of that, I think. But interesting, Deborah, that you say the numbers are falling off on Jews. Certainly something we should all attend to, pay attention to. I want to come to a question, or rather a point that was made by Marsha Parker, who's a tremendous worker in this field in Norfolk, that many people live some distance away from a synagogue or can't visit a synagogue. And this business of accentuating that Jewish life is lived in the home. I think, again, we're back to the field of the lived experience, aren't we? And worldviews and personal experience. There's been various suggestions about videos, people showing pictures of their own homes and stuff. And that's certainly an important aspect of it. Gil Deckel from Southampton said that he came across the accusation that, let's face it, the Jews did kill Jesus. It's still there. It's still there. Has anybody encountered this in their work, and what kind of answers would you want to give? Gil batted one down when somebody said, well, no, it's the Romans, they do crucifixion. And Gil said, well, that may be true, but nevertheless, according to the story, it was a Jew who handed him in. So anybody, Francis, I saw you nodding. Is this one you deal with?
Yeah, so this one we've dealt with quite a lot. We actually, so just for a teeny bit of context, we run a program called Anonymous Questions. There's a whole learning theory behind it that we implemented about 5 or 6 years ago, where the kids are given question cards at the beginning of every session, and they have all day, and at any point they can write down a question which they're either too embarrassed to ask in front of each other, think might be racist, anti-Semitic, anything. They write on the card and they put it in a post box, and at the end of the class we pick them out without having read them first, and we just answer whatever is on the card. And we've done a lot of training with staff to prepare them to be able to answer these types of questions. And some of them are just like really generic, just stuff they wanted to ask but forgot when they're in the class. And then a lot of the time we get questions like this about Israel. And the other one that we get a lot of is Judas and the betrayal of Jesus, and that question as well about him being Jewish. I think it is really tough, and I think there's no like perfect answer to the question. I think our approach is usually to ask what's behind the question rather than answering the question. Like, where's that come from? Where have we heard that? What is the, because it's often not a question. They already think they know the answer, so it's not really a question. They're sort of pointing out something, and they want to see what response perhaps you're going to give them, either emotional as well as like verbally. So I think a lot of the time the approach that we take is actually just to like respond push that back and say, like, where have we seen that? Have we seen that in TV shows? Have we seen that in magazines? Have we seen that on social media? Like, where's this coming from? And sort of going back to somebody who was in my breakout group, Gil, like really thinking about how do we push back on where we find information and like where the truth in that information is. I'll stop there because I'm sure the people have got things to say on it, but I think that's sort of our approach, is actually, again, like in a very Jewish way, ask the question back. Like, what is this? What sort of question is this that we're asking?
Right, I do think it's important, and the Catholic Church is particularly significant in this, how clearly they have retreated from any such implication. And one has to accept that whatever your views on diverse Christian positions, the Catholics do know something about Christianity and the Bible. So if they've stepped back from that, it deserves that individual rethinking what they think they know rigorously, both theologically and historically, as both of those things. Anybody else want to pick up on, yes, Sam?
Yeah, well, I suppose we might have a unique perspective here because we're in Leicester, so the demographics are wildly different than they are as anywhere else in the country. So not so much on the kind of the Christian perspective, but we get lots and lots of Muslim students come to visit us here, which I think is very interesting because, for a start, one thing that they immediately pick up on is all of the similarities that exist. But of course, there is also that friction as well. And depending on what's happening in the Middle East at the time, we have schools pull out last minute and say, well, the parents aren't going to let us come, or they'll they can ask difficult questions about it. And of course, we have the prayer boards here as well for the safety and security of the state of Israel. And by and large, when I've got primary school children, it's not super relevant to talk about the prayer boards that much. I'll say, these are the prayer boards, and that's kind of it. there is an all-Muslim girls' school that comes here every year as well. And while they were here, I said, and this is a prayer board, and this is a prayer for the safety and security of the state of Israel. Cue 40 teenage Muslim girls looking at each other very awkwardly and really not knowing how to kind of approach that situation. So it's not even, I think, just necessarily a Christian problem either, is that like lots of faiths have very negative kind of narratives about Jewish people, and trying to kind of talk about those and confront those and kind of work through them is one of the big challenges, really.
Yes, and indeed, of course, Samuel, the positives, those individuals go, oh, we love Jews. I mean, they're all so clever, aren't they? Or whatever it might be. The need to try and stop people making vast generalizations about Jews of any sort. Let's come to, we've only got a few minutes left. So on one leg, all of you stand on one leg. Tell me about Israel. How do you deal with that? Should we talk about it? So stay away. It's just, all right, whatever. Do you have to take a gun when you go into such a session? How does it work? Sam, you've just mentioned a group of Muslim girls looking uncomfortable, which may, of course, be the starting point for a really important educational moment. That discomfort that needs resolving somehow. Israel. I don't think any intelligent program on the Jews ultimately can avoid mentioning it. But what might you say or do? How do you cope with why are the Jews killing children in Palestine or whatever?
Well, okay, I mean, my job in that perspective is made quite challenging by the fact that the congregation itself can't really make up its mind on having any kind of unified stance and statement, which would, really clarify the position I'm meant to be taking. But kind of what I say is that I always work from a perspective that it's a very, very complicated historical situation. And I try to humanize it as much as possible. I talk about why members of the community here in Leicester have different feelings about the state of Israel. I talk about the emotions that are in the air when there is trouble going on. So although we're very far removed, and it's very important to emphasize the community here has no influence whatsoever on Israeli foreign policy or otherwise. I do say, for example, well, certain community members have children, they have family members who live under threat of rocket attack from Palestine, and that has the ability to impact how they feel, and it is very easy to, it's trying to make particularly Muslim students aware that what they're hearing is one side of the wall, as it were, and it's trying to show them what it's like on the other side of that wall, and that actually, there's not actually that big of, necessarily a gap here in Leicester between the two positions. They can be very concerned about what's happening to Muslim people in Palestine, and saying, the community is kind of sharing their concerns because their own family members are under a very similar threat. And trying to really kind of bridge that gap in a most sensitive way possible. As a historian, I know all I really know is that my understanding of the situation is nowhere near advanced enough to come up with my own opinion. So I kind of have to parlay it with other people's, and how other people in the community feel. That's always kind of been my approach to sidestepping the question.
Thank you, Samuel. Anybody else want to come in on this? Yes, Francis, very quickly, because we're running out of time.
I was just going to say, I think going back to what you were saying in the keynote earlier on about making sure we're not giving our own views on things is really important. It's something that we talk a lot about at the museum. And one of the ways that we find the information we need to have these conversations is by using some really good research out there. So JPR do all of the Jewish community surveys and, all of that research, and they publish all of this, and you can have a look at it and you can see actually it's very thorough. They get a really good broad spectrum across all the community, from religious through liberal, reform, Haredi, everybody. And within that, you can confidently say, look, the research shows that 98% of Jewish people say that they believe in the state of Israel existing. That doesn't mean everyone agrees with politics and everything else, but that is something that you can use as a conversation. I think what it does is distance yourself from having to say, this is what I think, or what people here think, or what people have said. It can say, look, there is information out there that we can base some of our conversations around, including this particular topic. It's it's research, it's done for us that we can use.
Thank you, Francis. Anybody else want to come in on this, or we're staying well away? Eve?
I work mainly with primary school children, so it doesn't come up.
Mhm.
But I bring up the connections with Israel in things like the fact that our calendar is linked to the Israeli climate, and our harvest festivals are linked with the Israeli harvest year. Hebrew is the language we pray with. So whilst I'm not dealing with the Israel-Palestine issue specifically, I am bringing out those ancient historical links because you can't avoid it. But at primary level, that's really realistically what we're doing. It's not generally coming up. I have had those issues in Muslim majority schools, because I know, for example, there's one Derby school that they can't go to a synagogue because the parents won't let them visit. They had me in instead. And again, it's about showing those links. So wishing them Shalom Aleichem, and they're immediately like, oh, that sounds like what we say, making those links. And as you said before, actually, you can make far more common links with Islam than you can with Christianity.
Yeah. We do need to wrap up. Thank you all so much. I think, again, you know, the lived experience thing, simply to say, look, I'm not going to try and get into the politics and the thing. This has gone on for 100 years and we're not going to sort it out in this 2 minutes. But let me tell you about my last visit to Israel, or what I saw when I was there, or those things. And there is a quote from the chief rabbi, Lord Jacobovitz, who said, 2 rights often make a wrong. I think that's quite a useful little thing. It is about sharing somehow. And we all know in schools how difficult it is sometimes to share. And perhaps trying to understand the story from the point of view of trying to share, and how difficult that is, might be a way forward. Rather than demonizing one side or the other, or trying to get into who's right and who's wrong, but leave it at that. But folks, we've covered masses of ground, but like so many of our presentations, we've only scratched the surface and been unable to deal with so much else. So I'm going to leave it, like I said, by saying there's masses we didn't talk about, and hand that back to the 70 odd folk on this call, and say to you, you will need to talk about it, either with your audiences, with your friends and colleagues, and with each other. So we all get more and more skilled, more and more fluent, and we have a bigger and bigger toolkit to respond to the kinds of things that come our way. Do try to get to those trainee teachers, and of course get to the teachers, because so often we're not really talking to the children, we're talking to the teachers. Hit a teacher right and you've got thousands of children. Right? Talk to a child and that's nice, but it doesn't make all the difference in the world. So folks, thank you to our panel, to Samuel, to Deborah, to Eve, to Francis, and to Karenza. Really, what a great panel, Ed. Thanks for pulling them all together. A tremendous crowd of folk, and a vast range of experience in this field. Thanks all.
Thank you, Clive. Kol hakavod to you chairing the panel, to everybody on the panel, and kol hakavod to everybody who has attended today. Before you disappear, I don't want you to disappear just yet. My thanks to you all for coming, because without you, it wouldn't be anything. You have made everybody in the room, the 70 odd, 75, 76 people in the room have made this event what it is today. And we'll be following up. So what I'm going to say to you